Morning everybody, hopefully you can hear me out there in webinar land. My name's Jim Hunt, I'm one of the nurse educators with Insights, and I'd like to welcome you to another Insight APSAB webinar. Without further ado, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're meeting today. I'd like to pay my respects to any elders past, present or emerging, and I'd like to extend that welcome and that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders that might be joining us in webinar land. And in addition to that, because it's Reconciliation Week, I also need to add an apology. And I think it's kind of timely that the presentation we've got for you today is actually one of our own experts at Insight. It's Michelle Taylor, who's an occupational therapist, and she spent some time developing a toolkit aimed at delivering a trauma-informed care approach and having sensory approaches in order to support people to manage trauma. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Michelle Taylor.
Thank you, Jim. Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to be with you today to tell you about these two new toolkits. Just before we go on, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land wherever it is that we are meeting today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge the traumatic impacts of colonisation on our First Nations peoples, and also the incredible strength and resilience of our First Nations people. I also want to acknowledge the lived experience of our clients and carers, whose stories and opinions have informed the development of our training and our resources. And this practice is integral to trauma-informed care and sensory approaches involving the client voice and experience to improve what we're doing. So there's a lot of people to thank up front for the tools that you will have access to as of today. Metro South Addiction and Mental Health Services for their e-learning package and trauma-informed care, which you'll see. The Mental Health Occupational Therapy Sensory Approaches Clinical Group in Queensland Health. The statewide reference group that has assisted with this. Clarence Street and Elizabeth Lowe and Jessica Halloran in particular for the great videos that you'll now be able to watch and learn more about sensory approaches from. Here at Metro North, Alcohol and Drug Service, big thanks to the Trauma-Informed Model of Care project team and the Sensory Matters Interest Group, and you'll be seeing some of the resources from them. Also, thank you to Insight, Dovetail, and the incredible ICT teams here that have brought you these resources, along with all those organisations and services whose tools and resources we highlight in our kits. So, trauma is not a story of something that happened in the past. Trauma is the imprints all experience leaves on your soul and your body as your sensations, from Bessel van der Kolk. So the world that we live in is a sensory one. And just as pleasurable things are experienced through the senses and remembered within our bodies and our sensations, so too are horrifying things. So we have this real intersection between trauma and the sensory. I like memory aids, so we've got this picture that you would have seen for today's webinar of the fidget spinners. So for me, this helps me to think about these two topics today. We're all different in our experiences of what's traumatic and how that manifests within us. So hence the different colours of the spinners. But even though it's a very personal experience, we're all connected. We can all be impacted by it, including us as workers. From a sensory perspective, a fidget spinner is a very body-based it's a sensory input. And so that's what I want us to think about too with the sensory approaches. Why would we use something like this, especially if we're being trauma informed? And we'll talk more about that. So it seems timely that we're talking about these today. If we think of the definition of trauma as something that really threatens our way of being or ourselves and perhaps overwhelms our ability to cope, we're all living through this pandemic. So perhaps that's bringing us some new insights about ourselves and how we manage. And it may also be challenging our clients some more. So here's today's outline. We're going to look at the trauma-informed care toolkit first. I'll give you a little overview of trauma-informed care, then a little tour of the toolkit and some ideas around application, and then we'll look at the e-learning module, which we're launching today. And with the sensory approaches toolkit, I'll give you a brief overview of sensory approaches and a little tour of that toolkit as well. So when we are working with people who have experienced trauma, perhaps these are some of the things that we might experience ourselves. We might wonder, do I have enough knowledge to be dealing with this? Is this part of my role? Is it something I should be taking on? There might be worries about what's going to happen. Can I deal with this? There's scary things or behaviours or risks that can come up in our practice. And also myths or attitudes that abound. So one of those is perhaps that this maybe isn't my work. I'm not a trauma therapist, and indeed I don't call myself a trauma therapist. I'm guessing that many of you out there are in that same boat. So often it feels like, help, you know, what can I offer? What can I do safely? So this is where trauma-informed care, its principles and practices really offer us a way to work with the people that we will be seeing, because we will be seeing lots of people with a trauma background. And from a lived experience point of view, Bradley Fox-Lewin has this to say: don't be afraid to open up a can of worms. That's a really common thought that comes up, especially when we run workshops. People are worried about that one. He says the person is already living with them. So what can we do about that? Some more advice from people with lived experience. Trauma is part of the human condition. It's impossible to go through life without experiencing trauma. So it's this shift with trauma-informed care to, it's not so much about them, but it's about all of us. And the last quote: the behavioural, emotional and practical adaptations that maltreated adults and children make in order to survive are brilliant, creative solutions, and are personally costly. So when we're working with people with a drug and alcohol history, then to be trauma-informed means to acknowledge that using substances may well be part of their way of coping, of surviving, of helping them at different times. So what is trauma-informed care? For some of us, it might represent a real paradigm shift. For others, it might be pretty much business as usual, depending on where you work and your frame of reference, your professional background. But at the end of the day, we're trying to raise awareness and think about all of our interactions as we're at work in these different areas. So we realise the widespread impact of trauma and understand potential paths for recovery. We recognise the signs and symptoms that occur in not just our clients, but families, staff and everyone in the system. And then we respond with this knowledge so that we act differently, we adapt things, and we integrate that into all those levels of policy, practice and procedures. And finally, and really importantly, we seek not to re-traumatise. Of course, this is something that no one sets out to do, but here this is where we're raising awareness and trying to reflect on how we seek to keep people safe and consider our practices so that we don't traumatise people who are already traumatised. So prevalence, it's very prevalent, up to 5 million people, it's estimated, in Australia have a lived experience of unresolved or complex trauma. And that there is the estimated cost. So it's a great personal but also an economic impact in our country. When you're working in the mental health or AOD sector, you can expect that most people you see will have a history of trauma. So a study out of the US, up to 90 people there are exposed to up to 90% of people there are exposed to multiple forms of trauma entering the service. In Australia, it's estimated that over 2/3, so again, a majority of people coming in to see us. That last stat at the bottom is a study done in Australia where it looks at us, people working in this field, and up to 1 in 5 people meet criteria for secondary traumatic stress. So let's have a look at the toolkit. I'm going to give you a little tour now. It's been up for a while, but we've got a couple of new additions, and this is designed to be very practical and to accompany our workshop at Insight. So what I've done here is I've taken a couple of screenshots of what you would see if you go onto the toolkit, the Trauma Informed Care Toolkit on the website. So firstly, what you'll see on the left there are a range of videos and webinars. So there's one on the brain, looking at the impacts on the brain, and there's one on neuroplasticity, which looks at habits and how we change neural pathways through our actions, which is really important with our clients using substances. Then you'll see 3 different webinars, Melissa Connell, Michelle Combo and Michelle White. I highly recommend these to you for further learning in this space. They're fantastic to check out. And finally is an intergenerational trauma video produced by the Healing Foundation. So that's certainly a good one to look at for all of us. So I'm going to go through now the ones you can see on the right. I'll just quickly tell you a bit about them so that if you're time poor, which I'm sure many of you are, you've heard a little bit about them and know where to go hunting for the thing that you need. So here at Metro North, we've had a team led by Melissa Connell developing a model of care for everybody in the AOD service. So it's been a big body of work, and there's several resources that have come out of this. So the first of these is this model of care document, and you can see there some of the different topics that they look at. They look at screening, supervision, all the sorts of elements that would be necessary to become fully trauma informed, having a full model of care. So this is something that would involve all of your staff on different levels. So if you and your service are thinking about becoming trauma informed as a whole service, I recommend having a look at these resources. This is a screenshot from one of the pages, and you can see here the 5 principles of trauma informed care: safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration and empowerment. Another one of their resources is managing and preventing vicarious trauma. So this is another one I'd highly recommend to you to check out. Even if the whole of your service doesn't have a model of care, you're not going in that direction, I think it can be very useful for us as workers to reflect on how we're coping, how we're looking after ourselves. It might also be a good document that you can look at using for supervision or to guide meetings even at times. And the other resources, the other resource out of this model of care is a clinical capability framework that the team has put together. So if you are looking to sort of advance your skills in this area, then this is one to check out. Now, these are a range of tools that we cover in the workshop. You can see here that we also have a video attached to each of these tools with Jade Phillips, who used to work at Dovetail and has been instrumental in developing many of these resources, including this one. So I'll just quickly tell you what this is because you can go and check the video. This is an acronym, the trauma one, which hopefully it's easy to remember, which spells out some of the things that you might see for someone who's experienced trauma or perhaps had PTSD if they've got that diagnosis. There's a traumatic event. R stands for re-experiencing in different ways, whether that's through the senses, whether that's through nightmares, thoughts, emotions. A stands for avoidance. And so this, again, it's commonly substances that help many of our clients to avoid, but you will see a range of ways that people will avoid engaging with things that might trigger them or make them re-experience that trauma that happened, that's past, but they're still feeling in danger. U stands for unable to function and looks at all the ways functioning has been impacted. M stands for month, which indicates that this endures for more than 1 month. And A stands for arousal. And this, in this area, we look at the way people's arousal levels are very much impacted when they experience trauma, often going to those two extremes of hyperarousal or hypoarousal. The 4 Ps. So this is one that I came up with, and it's because I have a poor memory and I like ways to remember things. And the 4 Ps is essentially a way to capture, if you like, some of the common areas where you might see challenges for people when they've experienced trauma. Remembering they may or may not have a diagnosis of trauma. So you might just be seeing some of these things and be wondering if they've had these sorts of experiences. So there's the physical, and that could be things like pain, tension, headaches, getting sick a lot. The psychological, this could be, some examples are mood, anxiety, the way people see themselves and the world, and shame is something that often comes up here. Performance is all those things that people need or want to do each day to live their lives. So it might be, you know, getting up and getting dressed, could be parenting, going off to work, studying, or getting off to sleep. And people stands for those profound impacts it has on relationships, people's ability to trust, to be intimate with others, maybe finding themselves in risky relationships. So it's really a framework for you to start thinking about all the impacts that it could have on somebody. And this is a self-care plan. The self-care plan helps you to think about what you're doing both at home and at work that might improve your self-care and look after you, and that might detract from it as well. I do recommend to you the Blue Knot Foundation and their website, as well as these guidelines. They really are world leaders in this space. I've certainly learnt a great deal from them, and they have a whole host of resources online and a range of training that you can do. NICABM, so I don't have to say the big long name, they produce a lot of great resources that are really visually appealing and quite easy for us and our clients to read, ones that you might use in session. We've got the window of tolerance one here that you can have a bit of a look at. So they're worth checking out and knowing about. If you're working with young people, the Out of Home Care Toolbox is a good one to look at. And if you're working with families and children, this is a site that might be helpful for you. If you're working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, there's some great resources from Metro South Health. This first one here is a brochure when you click on that. And this one here is a guide to help you work well with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And they've got some reflection questions here that I've put a screenshot on so that you can think about your own practice and how to improve. So this now is our new e-learning. It's an introduction to trauma-informed care for alcohol and other drugs practice, launching today. And I need to acknowledge the great work done by the Metro South Addiction and Mental Health teams. They originally created this online e-learning package, and they have generously shared it with Insight so that we could contextualize it for an AOD audience. So I'll just show you quickly what some of it looks like. You can see here the different topics. This is designed for everyone. So this is a great place for everybody to start if you're just starting out yourself or your organisation. It's for the peer workforce, it's for administrative workforce, it's for clinical workforce. And it has a range of lessons and interactive learning experiences, some infographics, just giving you a little bit of a feel for it. And then in each of the lessons, there's a place where you can check your knowledge. It also has case studies. And there's opportunities as well for you to reflect on your own practice. So this one's looking at self-care, and there's also opportunities to look at your clinical practice. So one of those principles of trauma-informed care, collaboration. What you'll see here is we've also got links to other Insight resources like the Client Engagement Toolkit or the Working with Families Toolkit. So if you want to learn more, you can hit those and then it'll take you to our page. This is the Families Toolkit, where you can keep learning in that space. And this is the one-day workshop, which currently we aren't running, but the plan is to be doing that again in the future. So this is another service that Insight offers for free, is the one-day workshop. And that's a chance to practice a lot of those tools and their application. Okay. So now we're going to move into the sensory approaches, which is indeed a trauma-informed approach. So I'm going to try something now. I just want to offer you a little bit of sensory input at this point in the webinar. And I'll invite you to just respond to some of the things that are going to come up on the screen. So firstly, we have this photo. If you're like me, you may be smiling away back at the dog. Another image, and it's very hard for us to be getting up and drumming and dancing in this space. But I've tried to provide you there with a little bit of vestibular input. We can use auditory in this space, so I am going to give you another sensory input now that I hope works. I'm going to play you a sound off an app. It's the sound of a storm. And the last one. So I just want to invite you to think about how you're feeling when you listened to or saw any of those. Maybe some of them made you feel quite happy, or maybe this one does. There's a bit of dopamine flowing. Maybe others made you feel a bit excited. Or for some people, the storm might even be a bit worrying. I was at the doctor's surgery the other week, and in the waiting area, I saw this sign, managing my emotions with the 7 natural physicians. And you can see it's got Dr. Thinkright up there. And Dr. Thinkright goes, got a problem. We're going to talk about this and work through it, but let's check with the other natural physicians first. So we've got a whole bunch of natural physicians at the bottom, like Dr. Vitality, who's saying, do you need to get up and move and do some exercise? Dr. UV Ray, who's saying, maybe you need some sunshine and you need to look at, moving your environment. So this, apart from the cute pictures, I guess what it says to me is these are bottom-up approaches. The idea is to use your body first, get that working well, so that then you're more able to think and talk with the doctor up the top. And it's very trauma-informed to use a bottom-up approach. Sensory approaches are a bottom-up approach. One way to talk about it is to say that we're improving the way that we feel and the way that we function by using our senses instead of some other ways that we might sometimes use, like talking or thinking through things. This is a snapshot from the fact sheet that we have in the toolkit. And you can see a few more explanations there. So sensory approaches are using all of the senses that you know, perhaps some that are newer to you, like vestibular and proprioceptive input. We use those to change our internal physiology. That changes that sensory input, that changes our levels of arousal, which then change our levels of distress, how we're feeling, and ultimately how we're functioning. And you can see at the bottom there that they use these lower levels of the brain. That's where they work. So you don't have to be able to think. They're not too demanding. And that's really important when we've had people who've experienced particularly complex trauma and are finding it hard to do some of those higher level executive functioning tasks, like thinking and talking through things. So there's similarities between modulating using a substance and modulating using sensory input. In the AOD world, we talk about neurotransmitters, and depending on which neurotransmitters become available through the use of a substance, and then what impact that has on the central nervous system. So if it's calming, we tend to classify that substance as a depressant. If it's alerting to the nervous system, it's a stimulant. And then there's a group that are really altering things, which we classify as an hallucinogen. So sensory input changes chemicals, changes neurotransmitters too. So we're often looking at this in parallel when we use a sensory approach, thinking about the nervous system, and we're thinking about, okay, are there other ways that I can use sensory input to calm me down or to alert my central nervous system? That mightn't always be a drug. And that's a snapshot of a scoping review recently done. Sensory approaches have an emerging evidence base. There's more and more studies coming out, especially over the last 5 years. Essentially, though, what this review showed was that it did reduce distress in the people involved. It was safe and effective. And it's best used when it's used alongside the approaches that you're already using. So I think that's really good news for us. In particular, I like using it alongside motivational interviewing, relapse prevention and management, and mindfulness. So you don't have to disband and not do what you're already doing. There's a really, vast array of research going on too around different types of sensory modalities or sensory motor activities. So we know that things like exercise and nature can improve people's mood. We're learning that yoga can help people with the symptoms of PTSD. So these are other areas that you can choose to drill down into when you get more of an idea of what particular sensory modalities or activities a person prefers. So here's the toolkit. And I have to say, I think it looks rather beautiful, but I am biased and I am very visual. So this is what you'll see when you click on to the toolkit. And I guess I just want to draw your attention to the fact that if this is new to you, there's lots of ways for you to start learning. And I would recommend that there's the full day workshop that we run at Insight. There's the Queensland Centre for Mental Health Learning, their e-learning package, which you can do for free online. And you can also discuss this with an occupational therapist. So these things are all really important. In my experience, sensory approaches, the beauty of them is they can be simple and accessible when people really need those sorts of interventions. But the assessment and the intervention and the clinical reasoning behind them isn't. So we don't just give people something because we like it. We use our clinical reasoning and we use the tools which I'm going to share with you now. So again, when you go onto that toolkit, this is what you'll see. There's one or two things added here that you can't see here, but it's pretty much as is. All right, so on the left, we've got the videos and we've also got a webinar. So at the top, you can see 3 great videos by Clarence Street staff talking to you about how they've been using sensory approaches with the young people there with substance use issues. So I really recommend having a listen to them and hearing how they're using them. Likewise, the webinar underneath that, in that I interview workers who've been using sensory approaches, so you can hear some excellent ideas and strategies for your practice. Then off to the right, we've got those tools and resources, which I will tell you some more about now. So this first tool, this is new, and I should say, I neglected to say that the Sensory Approaches Toolkit is brand new. We're just launching it today. So it's very exciting to bring you all of these. This is a new tool, using your senses to cope, which we developed in response to the pandemic, recognizing that this was a bit of a gap, that perhaps we could address ways for not just our clients, but also the people who look after them, their carers and families, and us as workers, to have some simple and effective ways to cope using the senses. Now, when you go to this on the website, we've made a tutorial, a little video that gives you a really good explanation. So I'm not going to spend much time on it now. And also in that little tutorial is a video animation with a case, so that you can hear how it could be applied. So the first 2 pages are really psychoeducation, helping people to understand what's normal, and that often people use alcohol and drugs as a simple way to change how they're feeling when times are hard, but also that can have a flip side. This page looks at arousal levels on the left there, and how it's very normal for these to get changed. Energy can become too high or too low, or might fluctuate, and people might even feel a confusing mix of the two. That next box talks to the fact that even if you've got a problem with your thinking, you can still use a sensory approach. So it's sort of spelling out to people all the different ways that you can use your senses to help you. But it is really especially effective when people have experienced trauma or need extra support, or if they're drug affected. And there's some of the benefits at the bottom, which we go into in detail in the workshop or in the e-learning. But it's easy, it's fast, it's fun, and it doesn't cost very much. All pretty important things. And it's this idea that even though you can have a terrible thing that's happened, the treatment doesn't have to be serious, even though the problem's serious. The treatment can be uplifting and playful, and sometimes that's what people might really be craving. So the final 2 pages are a worksheet, and the first one looks at sensory exploration, at people's preferences. You can see some examples that we've given people here, because often I find people, they're not sure. Sometimes it's hard to think up ideas, so we've provided a few examples. And then we go down the bottom to what doesn't help. That's very important as well. So we're trying to optimize those sensory inputs that help and minimize those that don't. On the last page, we've got these 2 areas. The top one is for when you're in a crisis or experiencing intense cravings. Some really helpful ideas there. And I might just draw your attention to the 2 on the right. This might be newer to you if you don't know too much about sensory approaches, but it can be a really effective way to help people to relax their breathing when they find traditional relaxation breathing exercises hard, where they have to think a lot. And the one below that is some ideas around grounding, which use pressure and movement. And there's a caution there as well I want to draw your attention to, that if you're considering using weighted items or essential oils, it's really important to get advice and training on this from an OT or another trained health professional. And at the bottom there, you've got some ideas for the everyday. So it's a little bit like our relapse prevention, that framework we've got here. We've got things that for those acute times, acute cravings and crisis, and then we've got things to consider for every day, how you adapt this to schedules and environments and activities and working with others. So we've got some excellent resources here from the Mental Health Occupational Therapy Sensory Approaches Clinical Group. And this is the fact sheet. This is a great one to check out for your own learning, but also if you're working with people, you could share this and talk through some of these ideas. And I'm going to show you a few resources now, a few tools that we use in the workshop. So you get more training on these at the workshop, but I'll give you a little overview here. So this is the sensory preferences checklist, where people have an opportunity to explore their different senses, as you can see down the left-hand side, those sensory areas, from a range of perspectives. So firstly, what calms or soothes me, coming down that nervous system, what alerts or energizes me. And then the final one is what aggravates or distresses me. So what really isn't helpful. And from an AOD perspective, that final column, we might be really linking that up to people's triggers, triggers for them to use a substance or triggers related to their trauma, and trying to minimize those where we can and adapt them. And then those two on the left are those positive, empowering ones that keep people safe and nurture them and help them feel in charge of themselves and their life. This is a little model called the tree that can perhaps help some of us to approach this work. Because sensory isn't prescriptive, it brings to us a myriad, an almost infinite number of ways that we might work with people and their sensory preferences. So the tree I created just to help you navigate that a little bit. And it starts off with explaining. So a good way to start with people is to help them understand, you know, what's this about? Why would you do it? A little bit of the neuroscience if people like that, or the evidence, making links to their drug and alcohol use. Exploring is where we might use that checklist and talk about some of those preferences that they have, what helps and what doesn't. We might use that tool to do some of these things as well, using your senses to cope. And embed's the last one, where this is, you know, this really matters because this is where it goes from being something you just talk about in session or in, you know, on the unit, to becoming a part of their life and them thinking about it when they wake up, putting it into their schedules and into difficult times. And that's on the back page. This is a checklist that's been created, again, to help you think about some of the different areas that you could potentially look at when you're working with people in this space. And as you can see, there's some ideas down the bottom, particularly related to AOD, like harm reduction, people in withdrawal, or going through different stages like contemplation or relapse. Okay, now we have here a couple of examples of a sensory plan which has been created, and it's based on a safety tool or a safety plan. And this is a tool that gets used frequently to help people stay safe. It comes from a trauma-informed perspective and out of sensory approaches as well. But the concepts in it won't be new to many of you. As you can see here, it starts off with it helps people to unpack, you know, what upsets or causes cravings, those triggers, what they notice in themselves, the warning signs, what helps them to cope and what doesn't. So you can really bring a sensory lens to this. The more you know about sensations, I think the more useful this can be, because all of these aspects can be really tied up with those senses that people continue to experience even though the dangers have passed. We've got some choices here. So, you know, it's important, being trauma-informed, to offer some choices to people. So we've got two different backdrops, and in the workshop we fill one in and start to reflect on what that would look like for ourselves. So you can see here, I've filled that in and I've written in some of the things that help me and don't help me. So I've factored a bit of that in today, preparing for my workshop. I walked to work and did a lot of moving and stretching to help me prepare. This is another tool from the statewide specialty group, and it's a clinical capability framework. It was put together over quite a number of years to try and help managers and clinicians to consider how they advance their practice safely and effectively, both on a personal level and within the organisation. So a tool has been created alongside that for self-reflection, and I do recommend you have a look at this or talk to an OT about this. This is something that I've been sharing with some of the people I work with who want to learn more. And we've got these domains that you can keep advancing in. So knowledge and skills, scope of practice, supervision role and education role, and you can rate yourself, whether you've got no experience right through to a specialist. And then at the bottom, there's places for you to look at what your needs are and how you're going to improve in your capability there. And this is a reminder of the workshop that we run each semester. And we actually managed to sneak one of these in before the pandemic this semester. So I run that. I really enjoy working that, running that workshop, and hope to see some of you there in the future. It's a very practical workshop, that one. And these are some quotes from people who've been using sensory approaches. Extremely calming, really relaxing, cozy feeling, sense of being safe. I felt an immediate improvement. I'm sick of talking. It's good to finally be doing something about my problems rather than just talking about them. So hopefully, when you have this tool alongside what you already do, having a sensory approach, it's not a panacea, it's not the only way, but it often fills this gap when people are struggling to think or talk or regulate their emotions at really tough times, or if they have that complex trauma history. So this is what we're all trying to do, isn't it? And I think we all bring this goodwill, but hopefully through trauma-informed care and sensory approaches, we feel that we not only have the will, but we have a way to do that. And that's what I've found really invaluable about learning more in both of these approaches, that it's made me feel safer and more confident in using these approaches with others and looking after myself as well as everyone that we work with.
Thank you very much for that, Michelle. I should start by saying there's some very positive comments in the chat section of the webinar. So thank you very much, Michelle. Many people have definitely found all of the tools extremely useful. And we've already answered a number of questions around them. A couple of questions that I have had come through is one which I'm sure you'll be familiar with the response to, is when it comes to using these tools for trauma, do you get any difference in engagement whether you're working with males or females? So do you find there's any gender differences with it?
That's an interesting question. I used to work as dual diagnosis coordinator for many years, and a lot of the people, I guess the majority of the people I was seeing in that role were males. They were often young males too. And that was a place where I was really starting out using sensory approaches. And I will confess that it felt sometimes a little, a little strange to bring some of these ideas, and that's why I think a lot of these tools might help you, because it was like, how am I going to talk to people about this? What's the consultant going to say when I talk about, what shower gel the person uses and what they eat for breakfast, and what they do before bed, what things they smell or touch. So it's a good question, and I think over the years what I've learned is that you'll be surprised every time. There is no one response, and some people really like this approach and others don't. That's okay. But I've been really surprised by a lot of men who have loved using hand cream, scented hand cream. And Clarence Street people talk about that as well. They've loved the weighted dogs so that they can have weight on their lap, which is it's a very grounding thing to do, to have that proprioceptive impact. So expect that people will laugh at you. That's what I always say. What a cool thing if you can help people to laugh as definitely. Well. Bring some energy.
I'd also say, obviously I know you fairly well and know a little bit about how you practice, but I think a lot of that goes into creating that safe space so that it's okay to allow that part of you to come out, to feel comfortable playing with, your senses, whether it's smells, touch, whatever it may be. And yeah, I would reinforce pretty much what you're saying, which is don't judge a book by a cover, because people may laugh, but if they feel safe, there's a good chance that they're going to engage in it and find parts of themselves that they didn't even realise were there, maybe. So thank you for that.
Make sure you've got the science and the evidence to talk to your managers and other staff about it, though, that I think so that they realise that we don't just go in and give everyone a stress ball. Yeah. There's science behind definitely. It, and there's clinical reasoning.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And there's another question. I apologise if I'm not asking exactly what you want. When it's typed, it's sometimes difficult to interpret. The question is, how does sexuality fit in here? And how do you manage to raise those discussions with the clients? So I'm guessing that's if somebody's having trauma around their sexuality or struggling with their sexuality, but I'm not entirely sure what the question was asking.
Okay. Well, I'll just attempt to give a response. So indeed, intimacy and sexual acts and practices they involve sensations, very much so. They're very sensory in nature, and people will have very personal preferences around that, and these will be informed by the lives they've lived, the trauma they have or haven't experienced, their relationships, and so on. So, we often use the word arousal. Sometimes people giggle when I use that in workshops or training. It's interchangeable with a bunch of other words, and you'll see on the tool I've used energy. I think it can be a really important thing to be, for some people to talk about this. So I might perhaps introduce it if I was working with someone as, this is just one of the meaningful occupations, given I'm an OT. I often talk about, this is one of the things that we might want to do that means something to us. And, it can alter our nervous system. Definitely. It can alter the way we feel and the way we function. Definitely. So you could, it's worth recognising too, because people might be using that, different practices, activities, or avoiding them to manage, to live their lives, and then it may or may not be working so well.
And I think I'll add to that, and I might drop you in it here, Michelle. But I would say, as well as those tools, I know that Michelle is always willing to receive telephone calls, emails. So if you do have specific things in relation to trauma and sensory approaches, then please don't hesitate to send us emails or give us a call, and we can discuss specific things further if we haven't answered that question. But thank you, Michelle. Couple of other questions. And we may have to send out resources later to these people. Does Insight have any online training or recommended authors to further learning in regards to an inpatient forensic ward, e.g. complex mental illness? Have you got any resources around a forensic setting that you would encourage? Obviously, I would encourage, I've worked in many forensic settings, and I would definitely encourage working through and getting a good understanding of the toolkit as you've gone through today.
I'd agree, Jim, that these two toolkits are made for a population who have complex, multiple problems going on. And I've seen them used all the time in secure units, forensic units, people who are, who have been secluded. And in fact, they came out of the sensory approaches and trauma-informed care approaches. They're intricately linked to a movement to reduce seclusion and restraint practices around the world. And what was recognised partly within that was we all have this will. We want to do well. We don't want to re-traumatise people through seclusion and restraint. But what can we do? What can we do that helps us and helps them at the same time? And these practices, these approaches, I don't know what I would do without them. Really, having worked in those sorts of areas you mentioned.
Yeah, I would just add on top of that, having worked in many forensic units, and even locally and within Metro North, and seeing the impact when sensory room snoozlums, as we used to call them back in the day, but sensory approaches are used, and you see the power that they can have. It's quite significant. So yeah, definitely have a look at these tools. Another question that's come through, which kind of builds on with the gender one, is do you notice any difference between adult and youth, and would you adjust anything in your approach when working with adults as opposed to youth?
So I'm not sure if that person's maybe working with adults. If you're working with youth, do check out the Clarence Street videos. They're awesome. If you're working with adults, the webinar that I did gives you lots of practical ideas. I think it's all in how you frame it up with people very much, and you'll know your clients. They'll all be different. So some of my clients love to hear the neuroscience intricately. That's really empowering for them. And I'll ask them if they want to know about that and the evidence, because that can really back up why they're doing some of this stuff that's a bit kooky or simple or, not what anyone else has told them before. But they'll also say things like, no one's ever asked me about, what sensations I prefer, and no one's ever helped me make some of those links to my body and how I don't feel in charge of it and why I'm taking substances and these terrible things that happened. So I'm not sure if I'm answering that question, but
do you find people get surprised when a sensory approach has an effect and it releases emotion, or it releases things that allow them to either view things differently or express things differently? Do you find that people get surprised with how powerful that can be?
Yes. And yes and no. I think also when you help them to reflect, and us as workers too on our everyday lives, even reflecting on the pandemic. I've been doing this in supervision with some OTs, and we've been reflecting from a sensory point of view what that's meant to us. And it didn't come, I suppose, as too much surprise that we were relying much more on our sort of nourishing our nervous system through use of sensory motor activities and sensory inputs, because we were tired, we were stressed, we didn't want to keep using our brains all the time. There's that load on us. So those things do make a lot of
Yeah.
sense, I think.